I've written this book about Major Chadwick. It was a very interesting experience researching his life. I can't really begin to even skim the surface of everything I found out today. So what I'd like to do is just, I thought what I'd do is show you some of the photographs that you might one day use to illustrate the book, and just to talk around the pictures a little bit. Today I thought I'd talk about Chadwick's life before India, and the stages that led him up to going out to Arunachala, and tomorrow I've got another hour and I'll look a little bit at his life in the ashram, his relationship with Bhagavan, and so on. So here's the first picture, I hope. It's working. I'm sorry that's a bit blurry. That's the best I can do at the moment. One day we might get a clearer picture of this chap. But I hope it's not so blurry that you can't see the key features. The key features here being the moustache, and this, the dog collar. The moustache perhaps dates it. People don't wear moustaches like that anymore. That is very much a Victorian moustache. And the dog collar sort of locates it theologically.
That's his
we're
father?
in.
His father?
Well guessed, Dennis,
Oh.
yes. No interruptions from the floor. Dennis will spoil the surprise. That is Chadwick's father, who, as you see, was a priest in the Church of England. He was born in 1854, in the middle of the 19th century, in the north of England, in Lancashire, or Lancashire, as Dennis would say. Sorry. In Lancashire. And important thing to notice about him, we'll say more about him later, but for the moment I just want to say his father was also an Anglican priest. So on his father's side, Chadwick had at least 2 generations of priests coming down to him, so a very religious family. It may have gone still further back than that. I haven't looked. There may be more priests going further back. I think, although it's blurry, that picture gives you a good idea of who this man was. He was a powerful and imposing personality, somebody you didn't cross lightly. Chadwick is remembered in India for having a sort of booming voice that settled arguments and kept everybody in line. I think you can see there where he got that from. And the other thing to say perhaps is that in those days the Victorian church was still very sure of its ground in England. All middle class people went to church. Nobody really doubted the Bible or the Christian message, and of course it was still the most powerful nation on earth. And I think you can see a little of that sort of political, theological and moral certainty coming out of this man. Very powerful. So that's Chadwick's father. We'll see more of him in a minute. Now on to his mother, if I hit the right button. There's no picture of Mrs. Chadwick, that's what that means. This is I pieced that to an internet site. And virtually everything I know about Mrs. Chadwick is there on the screen. Her name was Madeline. She was born about 3 years after her husband, and she died about 3 years after him in the 1920s. The only other thing to say about her before we move on is that her father was also a priest. So on both sides of the family you have this priestly pedigree. So what Chadwick had in his bones and in his blood, if you like, was Christianity and the Church of England. I say I can't show a picture of Mrs. Chadwick, so I'm going to do the next best thing and show you this, which you may recognise.
Did she die in England, Lewis?
She died in England, yeah, in Brighton. That's where the family were living then. A picture of Bhagwan there on his sofa, or one of the sofas. As I say, this is the next best thing to a photograph of Chadwick's mother. And the reason I say that is because I've got a very nice quote here that Chadwick wrote years after his mother's death, when he was living in India, he wrote a very nice little piece about Bhagavan. And he said, "Sometimes when I walk into the hall, I see my mother come back to life, sitting in front of me. The same expression of welcome, the same loving interest in the look with which I am regarded as I take a seat. It is almost uncanny." So there you see a sort of expression of Bhagavan's possibly even miraculous power to take on somebody else's shape, as it were. Chadwick would walk into the room and say, "Oh, it's my mother," and then have to remember, no, it's Bhagavan. So that tells you a lot about Bhagavan and Chadwick's very close relationship with him.
Although you know that there was a number of other people who made
I was just going to say,
that.
this is by no means unique to Chadwick. There are lots of people who said the same thing. Lots of people, I don't need to tell you about this, I shouldn't be telling you about this. Lots of people would say that the Bhagavan reminded them of their father, their grandfather and that sort of thing. So it's by no means unique to Chadwick. But he did say that, and I just want to, as we haven't got a photograph of his mother, say that's all I've managed to dig up about her really, is that quote. And I think it tells you what a sort of loving mother she must have been. She must have been a very concerned, devoted parent for him to have... Sorry? Are you here?
No. We're on the photograph.
The T.N. Venkataraman on the right side.
We're on the photograph.
Who took the photograph? I'm just coming to that. I can identify one person in this photograph, and you can identify the rest. Two, yes. I know two of them. Anyway, his mother must have been, very, very loving and devoted and so on. That's what I'm saying. The people in this photograph, that's interesting. Is this Dennis?
T.N. Venkataraman. Yeah, the president.
Is it?
Do anyone know this
Sri
person?
Venkatu. Sri Venkatu when he was young, yeah. T.N. Venkataraman.
And
That's
this
her
one.
grandfather.
And there's Chadwick. It's interesting. I had looked at this picture many times
Maybe that man.
before I ever noticed Chadwick was standing there. And I think this is a great symbol of what Chadwick was. There he's literally at the Maharshi's right hand, and yet somehow you don't see him. Somehow I've looked at it again and again, and perhaps because Bhagavan is so magnetic, the eye is drawn to him, and you don't notice that tall, pale, almost kind of ghostly figure standing in the background. This is a great symbol of what Chadwick was. I always think when I look at this picture, he's like a sort of a presidential aide or a spin doctor at a White House briefing. The president is the star of the show, and the spin doctor has to kind of keep in the background and all that sort of stuff. Spin doctor knows that if he becomes the story, then he's kind of failed in his job. That was very much Chadwick's attitude. If you read his reminiscences, you learn almost nothing about Chadwick himself. You learn a lot about Bhagavan. There's nothing about Chadwick. He kept himself in the shadows. That's why he was an interesting person to research, but also a very difficult person, because he left no traces really. And I kept on feeling that he was always escaping me. So there he is. The other interesting thing to note is that in this picture, you would have to say that Chadwick has gone as far as a Westerner can go, perhaps, to converting to Hinduism. If you could turn yourself into a Hindu as an Englishman, you'd look a bit like that. So the sort of question of today's talk is looking back at Mr. Chadwick, how did that happen? And from a Christian point of view, what went wrong? I mean, I don't mean that in a sort of nasty way, but I think he would have been surprised at what had happened, and possibly even horrified. Traditional Christianity, of course, teaching that Jesus Christ is the only way to salvation. You would have to imagine that this man would have thought his son had therefore lost his salvation by going out to India and bowing down to an Indian guru, who I think Mr. Chadwick would have regarded as a false god. So it's interesting. And I think the seeds of what went wrong or what happened to Chadwick are actually contained in Mr. Chadwick, as we will see. I know quite a lot about him because he was the headmaster of a small English grammar school. Now you see him at the centre there, surrounded by his pupils. A grammar school was a school where boys from sort of relatively modest backgrounds would go to get what you might call a classical education on the cheap. You would have a chance, you learn Latin and Greek here, and therefore afterwards you would have a chance of going to one of the big universities, Oxford or Cambridge, and further in your career. Mr. Chadwick was a brilliant teacher, he was a great educationalist, and from this humble little school he conjured up a whole string of scholarship successes and good exam results and so on. I say it was a small school. You can see that's the whole school. It's more like one class really, it's tiny. That's the whole school, and in 1883, this was the year Mr. Chadwick started as headmaster.
Reverend Chadwick.
The Reverend, his full name was the Reverend James Herbert Chadwick, and he was Chadwick's father, yeah. Chadwick's not in this picture as far as I know. Oh no, of course he wasn't, Chadwick wasn't born, but this is Chadwick's father. And that's Chadwick's father with his little school, which was here, that's Basingstoke.
It's just outside London, isn't it?
It's just outside London, yeah.
I have a relative who lives there right now.
Oh really?
Yeah.
There you go. So your relative has a sort of connection to Chadwick. You could drive from London, I guess, in about an hour and a half, maybe an hour if you were being a bit naughty. If you'd gone to Basingstoke in Chadwick's day, it would have looked something like this. This is just a bit of fun. This is to give you a sort of atmosphere of what it was like. This is the world Chadwick grew up in, as it were. This is Basingstoke Town Hall, which, as you can see, is a very fine sort of, I think, Regency building. We were talking earlier, Evelyn, about Jane Austen. Jane Austen was a local resident, and she would often have visited this place, and all those things went on there. All that sort of English classic stuff, whatever it's called. Just a couple of more shots of Basingstoke. This is a street Chadwick would certainly have known, because it was not a big town. It was a town of about 9,000 people. So Chadwick would have known that street. He may even have known some of the people in that photograph. And if you'd left the centre of Basingstoke and walked up a slight hill called Worthing Road for about 5 minutes, it's quite close to the centre, you would have come to this place. That's the school. I'm very sad to say that it's been demolished. I would have loved to see it and see the place where Chadwick had actually been born and grown up. It's long gone. But I think you can see from that picture what sort of place it was. I think it was probably a lovely place to grow up. I think he was very privileged in lots of ways. It was a very, very safe and stable beginning to his life. As you may know, lots of English boys, little English boys, have the misfortune of being sent away to a prep school at a very early age where they're treated very badly, usually. That's happened to my father. I had a terrible time. Chadwick avoided that. Because Chadwick's dad had his own school, Chadwick was able to stay here, and this was his school and his home until the age of 14. So he had a very, very stable, loving background. And if you think about what I was saying about his mother earlier, he obviously, even when he'd arrived in India, had a great love still for his mother. So she must have been, I imagine, a lovely woman.
So he lived in the same building?
Yeah.
At the school?
Yeah, I think that, because it's all gone, I can't really work out. There's another shot of it I'm just going to show you, which gives you more of an idea of the scale of the place. This is it in the snow. There you are, a bit of English atmosphere. I think this is probably the chapel down here on the right. Chadwick would have spent a lot of time there, I imagine. And they lived there, yeah. And I think that after...
That doesn't look like a single classroom school to me.
No, it's strange. The school inspectors, when they visited here, said it's incredibly cramped, it's overcrowded, there's not enough space, there's nowhere to hang the coats. There would be two classes in the same room. So at one end, a room of this size, Mr. Chadwick would be at one end teaching scripture, and the guy teaching mathematics would be at the other end trying to do the same thing in the same room. It was very overcrowded, it was underfunded. I know, it looks quite impressive, I can't understand that. But that's what the school inspectors said. Anyway, when they'd all gone home for the holidays, Chadwick and his brothers and sisters would have had the run of this place. Must have been like being the sort of son of an aristocrat, but without being rich, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how you look at it. I've got one picture, there's only one picture that I could find of the inside of the school. You can see it's not grand, it's not eaten or anything like that. It looks a bit kind of run down.
That's the chapel?
No, I think this is the school hall because you can see, well, there's an old stove there. This is the lectern, a bit like this sort of a farewell. I imagine Mr. Chadwick would have stood and addressed the school and read to them from the scriptures and led them in prayers and that sort of thing. And here's the school piano, where he would have led them in hymns and in the old school song, because apparently he was something of an artist, a musician. He was very, very musical, apparently. So we come back to him now and ask what went wrong.
Or what went right?
Or what went right, depending on which side of the fence, if there is a fence, you want to look at it from. What went right? Okay. I'm going to say, what did you do wrong, because it's English irony. What did you do wrong? I've highlighted 3 mistakes that Mr. Chadwick made with his son's education that ruined him and sent him off to India. The first mistake was that he did not hit people enough. He didn't use the cane enough. Any Victorian headmaster could have told Mr. Chadwick, spare the rod and spoil the child. He didn't do that. Well, I'm sorry, he did do that. He spared the rod and he spoiled the child. In most Victorian schools, all the masters would cane the boys all the time. It was just a matter of daily routine that you got thrashed. In Mr. Chadwick's school, and we're getting on to the sort of core of him now, none of the junior masters was ever allowed to cane the boys. That's the first thing. The headmaster, to give him his due, he did have a cane, but unfortunately he hardly ever used it. Queen Mary's could go a whole year without seeing one single caning, which, this is the age of Oliver Twist. This is extraordinary. This is sort of beautiful, actually. It's beautiful. So what it meant was that if you were just a moderately well-behaved lad, you could get through your whole education under this man without being caned. Wow, that's absolutely marvellous. And what his pupils all remembered about him, although he looked very sort of stern and fierce and all that sort of stuff, what they all remembered, and the one word that's used again and again to describe him, is kindness. They all remembered his kindness. They all looked back on him with great affection and said how kind he was. So that was the first mistake. Too kind. Second mistake was that he encouraged his pupils to think for themselves. Again, you didn't do this in Victorian education. Victorian education was not about thinking, it was about learning. You were there to memorise things, and if you forgot them, you'd be caned. But Mr. Chadwick had a completely different educational technique. His technique was to encourage the boys, to encourage them to draw their own conclusions, to debate and all that sort of stuff. And you can see the seeds of catastrophe here. First of all, you don't hit them. Secondly, you encourage them to think for themselves. And so the blame for what happened to Chadwick, really a lot of it rests here. I'm going to look just very briefly. It's a bit technical. I don't want to get into it too deeply. But we need to know where he stood spiritually if we're really going to understand Chadwick. And so this, this is a bit crude, but here you go. This is Christianity. It's 2 strands. This is a sort of representation of the Protestant wing, which you see on this side, and the Catholic wing, which you see on this side. The Protestant wing, I don't want to tread on anyone's toes. This is being recorded. I always think this is a bit more like a mosque. This is like a mosque, and this is more like a Hindu chapel, or a Hindu temple, sorry. That's what I kind of feel. And on this side, everything is sort of sparse and clear and basic and logical, and it's all focused on our Lord, and there's nothing else. On this side, it's all more sort of about abundance and variety, saints, angels, the Virgin Mary, the Holy Family, all those people. Incense, chanting. These are sort of Hindu things, yeah? And I think another way of putting it is to say this is the masculine principle, if you like. This is reason. And this is more like the feminine principle. So this is all to do with logic, and this is all to do with intuition. This is philosophy, and this is mysticism, magic, miracle. Those things are all over on this side. So masculine and feminine, put it in Eastern terms, and forgive me if I got this wrong, Shiva and Shakti, is that more or less it? Chadwick says, it is not enough to have Shiva alone. Shiva must be balanced by Shakti, which makes perfect sense. And in the 19th century, there was a big movement in the English church that said we've lost the balance. It's got too much like this. We need to move it more back towards this, which is what it used to be like before Henry VIII and all that nastiness. We need to get more back towards that. That movement was very, very controversial in England because this is unfortunately what the French do and the Italians and those people. Those were our traditional enemies in England. We didn't want this sort of thing happening in England. It was considered very foreign. And I think if you look behind a lot of these religious conflicts, you find nationalism, xenophobia, and all that nasty stuff. That was very much present here in this argument. And so when people in the Church of England started moving back towards that, there were riots, there was violence. Some priests were actually put in prison, not many, but some were put in prison for doing this sort of thing. That was Chadwick's, the sort of background against which he grew up. And his father was one of this lot. He was what you would call an Anglo-Catholic. He was a Catholic in everything except allegiance to the Pope. So you see, I'll put those three mistakes together. What sort of message does this send to your son? He's telling him it's all right to be a bit foreign, a bit different, a bit unconventional. He's also filling him up with all this incense and chanting and rituals and all that sort of stuff. And I think when Chadwick arrived at the ashram, as I myself did, he would have felt very much at home with all that. It's sort of Catholicism in a slightly different guise. So there you see, in Mr. Chadwick's kindness, his lack of violence, his modern approach to education, encouraging to work things out and think, and in this, you see the seeds of what happened to Chadwick. We've got to leave him now. I've spent too long talking about him because he's a hero. I think he was a great man. And if the ashram owes a debt to Chadwick, it owes one to him as well. Okay, now a quick look at Chadwick's family. There they are. This is a very quick look. This is just to show you his brothers and sisters. And the reason I chose 1902 is because that's when his youngest sister Enid was born, 12 years younger than him. Chadwick himself, born in 1890, so it's always easy to work out how old he was at any time. You just add 10. So in 1935, when he went out to Arunachala for the first time, he was 45 years old. Okay. I've discovered some pretty interesting stuff about that, but we'll move on because I'm going to run out of time. Okay, the screen's gone dark. This is the end of chapter 1, that's why. That's the first bit, that was all about his sort of childhood and so on. I've said up until the age of 14, he was allowed to stay in that very sort of safe, comforting environment at home. And then that all ended when he was 14, and he got sent off here. Now that's a big school. This is St Edward's School in Oxford. You can see immediately that it's a much grander, more magnificent affair than the little place Mr Chadwick was running down in Basingstoke. David Godman told me that in Chadwick's room in the ashram in the 1980s, if you went and stayed in there and opened the cupboards, you would find inside pictures of Oxford, and people thought it was his Oxford College. All those years afterwards, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating insight into what Chadwick was and how he kept his sort of background was still alive in him in a way. I think it may have been pictures of his school, but also possibly his college. But anyway, there are pictures of Oxford in the ashram. This is a proper public school. Okay, so this is proper English education. Now, But it wasn't a very old school. It had been founded in the middle of the 19th century by this character. This is Thomas Chamberlain. He was long gone by the time Chadwick arrived. But I think you can see, just from that picture, wow, they don't make them like that anymore. He was a cold, hard, austere, uncompromising man. And he was also an Anglo-Catholic, so he's on that Catholic wing of the church. And his school very much bore those imprints. St Edward's was said to be the most violent school in England. If you know about English education, you'll realise this must have been a pretty tough school. It's been said that the cane rose and fell incessantly. All the boys, as I've said, all the masters caned the boys all the time. Also, the prefects were allowed to cane the boys or beat them with a hairbrush. And the boys bullied each other. When there wasn't enough violence going on, they invented some. So, for example, small boys would be tied to a rope and then pulled up so they hung from the ceiling. There was electric shock machinery. They would give each other electric shocks just for a bit of entertainment. So that, I mean, there you are. It's the sort of typical ghastly public school education. On top of that violence, there was a great deal of physical hardship. It was a tough, Spartan place. There was no hot water. I imagine that. It's bad enough when you go to the ashram, there's no hot water. Imagine in an English winter, you've got to wash in freezing cold water. There wasn't enough food because the school was short of money and they kind of looked on food as a bit of a luxury and all that sort of thing. It was pretty ghastly. So it was designed to make a man of you, that's the thing. And at the centre of it was religion. It was a highly religious school. That's the school chapel. So Chadwick would have been in and out of here like a yo-yo for various services and rituals and all that sort of stuff. And as I said, it was a school in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And it was very unpopular. This school was in Oxford, which is in the heart of England, middle-class England. And as I said, this is regarded as sort of foreign, French and that sort of thing. People used to spit at the gate of the school to express their disgust for what was going on here, because it was considered so Catholic. They hated it. And they used to whisper that it wasn't a normal school, but a seminary. It was a college to train priests, and that when they'd been released, those priests would sort of infiltrate the Church of England like cancer cells to destroy it. It wasn't actually a seminary, but it was the next best thing. And when I look at it, sometimes I think going to this school must have been like being sucked into a cult. You know, you take your son, you take a son away from his parents at an early, impressionable age. You subject him to violence and dehumanising treatment, and you comfort him through all that with a very attractive religious message, a very powerful religious message. And this technique worked. 1 in 7 of the boys who left this school went on to become priests. 1 in 7. Even by the standards of those days, that was an extraordinary record. They produced a huge number of priests. And the important thing from our point of view is that by the time Chadwick left, at the age of 19, he was one of them. So this is a sort of key point. Chadwick left school at the age of 19, wanting to become a priest. It's natural enough if you think about it. He was the most spiritual of the family, obviously, with the possible exception of his sister. His fathers had been priests before him, his grandfather had been a priest, or both grandfathers. And then you put him in this environment and kind of the inevitable happens.
How do you know that?
Because there was a record when he went to university, when he arrived at his Oxford College, they did an interview, a sort of entry interview, and said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "I want to be a priest." By Chadwick standards,
you found that record?
I found that record. By Chadwick standards, that's an enormous discovery. I mean, that little scrap. Writing his biography, there's very little to go on, so I have to kind of extrapolate from those little scraps. But that one scrap is hard evidence that at the age of 19, he definitely wanted to be a priest. Another very interesting bit of evidence that I used was something from the ashram archive. When Chadwick was much older, living in India and all that sort of stuff, he got a Hindu astrologer to draw up his horoscope, his astrological chart. When he'd taken delivery of the chart, he sat down in his room and he wrote out the whole of his life in astrological periods, with just a couple of lines for each period. And I think he did that just to see how well it matched the chart, to see if it had been correct or not, I don't know. But anyway, they've still got that document, and it's very, very useful writing his biography. So there's Chadwick's handwriting. You can see it's marvellously atmospheric, it's sort of brown with age and all that sort of stuff. Carefully preserved in the Ashram archive. Birth, March 19th, 1890, and then the bit I've highlighted using my computer skills, became spiritually inclined at 16. So that, presumably, we'd have to say, is one of the big dates in Chadwick's life. At the age of 16, he had some sort of spiritual awakening, but we now know that it took place in that sort of violent Catholic environment. No doubt he would have become spiritually awakened wherever he'd gone to school, but that school and that background pushed him towards Catholicism and the priesthood. The other thing he'd have been doing at school was this sort of thing. These are boys from his school in the officer training corps. Unfortunately, this is 1910, that's just a year after he left, so Chadwick isn't in that picture. But boys at public school would have learnt to march and drill and give orders and take orders and to shoot. Chadwick could shoot before he left school, and that was going to be very useful to him in 4 years' time after this picture was taken. Chadwick was brought up, although Mr. Chadwick was a bit unconventional, and in his religious beliefs, he was a staunch patriot. He believed that Englishmen should die for their country without a moment's hesitation. Chadwick was brought up that to believe that your first allegiance is to the King of Heaven, but your second allegiance, and not very far behind, is to the King of England. So those are the two sort of sides of his loyalty, if you like. And he demonstrated that by joining the officer training corps. There's one last school picture before we end this little section. That's his set. You're going to ask me where Chadwick is, and I'm going to say I don't know. The school promised me that he's somewhere in this photograph. I've looked at it, and I can't decide which one he is. Perhaps someone who's better at recognising faces will have a look afterwards. I don't know if you can see him there. He's 17 when this was taken, so he's not one of these little chaps at the front, but possibly one of this row. He's meant to be in there somewhere. I say, as I said, he hides himself away, and sometimes you just can't see him, but he's there somewhere. Okay, so we're asking what went wrong, and the answer is so far, absolutely nothing. Things are going perfectly. Everything's absolutely on track. Chadwick is ready to follow his father and his grandfathers into the priesthood and become a good law-abiding, as it were, Christian. So now we're getting to the sort of disaster, as it were, and this is where I think it happened. This is the Queen's College, Oxford. That's Chadwick's Oxford College. It may have been a photograph like this that he had on the inside of his cupboard, I don't know. A beautiful, beautiful place. Must have been a lovely place to study and so on. And of course, the fact that Chadwick got in here tells you something about his, he had something above the collar, so to speak. He arrived wanting to be a priest. We don't know what he studied. This is the next big thing. Normally, if you're researching somebody's biography, you just get in contact with the university and say, what did this person study when he was with you? When you do that with Chadwick, Oxford say, we don't know because he didn't get a degree. In other words, he dropped out. In other words, Mr. Chadwick failing to beat him and turn him into a hippie. That's basically what happened. He dropped out of college. He probably wasn't smoking pot in those days, they didn't have it. But he dropped out, that's the thing. Joking aside. So we don't know what he studied. So therefore, you have to kind of guess. And my guess in the book I've written is that he was probably studying theology, given that he wanted to become a priest, and also because there's later evidence that he was a trained theologian. He was much more expert about these things than the average Christian. Whether or not he was studying theology, he would have come into contact with this man. Isn't that an interesting picture? I find that fascinating. You can see the intelligence there. Kindness. But he looks afraid to me sometimes, and uncertain, unsure. It's a fascinating picture. This is one of the most brilliant theologians in England at the time. His name was Bernard Hillman Streeter. He is still remembered today for his work on the New Testament. In his field, he was important enough to be remembered. And he was also the Dean of Chadwick's College. So he was the chap in charge of discipline. Another interesting thing about Chadwick is that he was a heavy drinker. From school, I think he started drinking at school. He must certainly have drunk a lot during the First World War, because they all did, I think, just to survive. And right up until he arrived in India, I think he hit the bottle. The reason I mention that in this context is because it conjures up a picture of the young Chadwick at the age of 19, sort of coming in late to the college, drunk, making a noise and all that sort of thing. And Streeter was the person in charge of college discipline. So you would be taken in and told off by this guy. And he was also a theologian. So one way or another, they must have got to know each other. And I think I'd try not to get too technical about this and just quickly give you a rough idea. I think meeting Streeter for someone from Chadwick's background at the age of 19 would have been absolutely devastating from a religious point of view. And I think this is where it all fell to pieces for him. And I think this is, if you eventually ended up going out to India, I think this guy must take a lot of the credit or the blame for it. By the time Chadwick arrived at university, Christian theologians were prepared to let most of the Old Testament go, or much of it. Mr. Darwin had come along in the middle of the 19th century and proved that Genesis was basically a fairy tale. With Genesis went a lot of other stuff. And so they're now saying, more or less, okay, we accept that a lot of what's in the Old Testament is sort of fairy stories, if you like, from the childhood of mankind. But, they said, we draw a line, and on the other side of the line we have Jesus Christ. He is our Saviour, and the New Testament contains broadly reliable historical records about this man. And that's what Chadwick believed when he arrived at university. Obviously, if he wanted to be a priest, he must have believed in the New Testament. That's a sort of basic entry requirement. And I think he was a bit like a young man who had been brought up to believe in a unicorn. And all his elders and betters assured him that this unicorn had existed and it had walked the earth 19 centuries before. And Streeter said, sorry, mate, unicorns do not exist. In the modern age, we have to be scientific, we have to look at these things rationally, and we have to accept that you've been told a fairy tale. That's basically what he was saying. So in other words, Streeter was a person who crossed that line and said in the New Testament as well, there's a lot of myth and fable, and we've got to clear it out and make Christianity relevant to the modern world. So now you're starting to see, I hope, why coming into contact with this man and discussing spiritual matters with him might make you less inclined to become a priest.
Although you have no evidence of that.
Evidence? No. I have this, as I say, it's very difficult for Chadwick because he leaves so few clues behind him. I have hard evidence that he wanted to be a priest. I have hard evidence that he knew Streeter. The rest is kind of using it to paint a picture of the sort of crisis, the probabilities he went through. I can't prove this 100%. The fact is, after a year after Chadwick dropped out of university, for whatever reason, Streeter produced this. This was a book that kind of, it's called Foundations, but it really shook the foundations, I think, of the Anglican Church. A statement of Christian belief in terms of modern thought. So you see, I mean, that tells you what he's trying to do. He's trying to make Christianity relevant to the modern world. He's trying to make it fit in with science. The problem with science is that it doesn't compromise. You know, you can't argue with it. It's kind of immobile. So if you want to fit in with science, you just have to break off the bits of you that don't fit until you're the right shape. You see the problem. And so this is kind of what Streeter is here doing to the New Testament. I'm going to give you one very quick example. An excuse to show you a beautiful painting by Piero della Francesca, The Baptism of Christ. It always reminds you of Ganapati Muni, to slightly change the subject, who saw a light come down on Bhagavan's head
yes.
and touch him 6 times. No Christian can read that story without, well, I certainly can't. As soon as I read it, I thought, it's the baptism, it's the divine sign that this is the one. You kind of can't avoid that resonance. And I think Chadwick must have found these things again and again in India. He would have found these Christian echoes, as I do when I go through the literature. Anyway, to focus on this, traditional Christians believe that at the moment of his baptism, the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove, descended on our Lord's head, and a voice boomed from on high, the voice of God himself, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." All Christians know those lines. All traditional Christians believe this story to be a historical fact. And they believe it to prove the unique status of Christ in human history and amongst all spiritual figures. That's why they would not compare him to Bhagavan, because of this sort of thing. They believe there's God, there's the Holy Spirit, and there's Jesus Christ. They're up there, and we're down here. It's something quite different. And of course Streeter has his own take on this. Streeter says, no. Jesus was a first century Israelite. He was a first century Jew. He was in the tradition of Jewish prophets. Like all of them, he had visions and mystical experiences. What happened to him was, at this climactic moment of his baptism, he had a vision. He thought he saw a dove, and he thought he heard this heavenly voice saying, "You are my son." But it's all in his head. But the interesting thing is that once he's had this vision, Jesus comes to a startling conclusion about himself. Because if the voice from on high says that I am the one, therefore I'm the Messiah. Not me, obviously. And therefore the end of the world is at hand. That's the conclusion. The Jews in the first century were waiting for the Messiah to come down and end the world. That was his job. That was why he would arrive. To end the world and throw off the Roman yoke and establish what is known as the New Jerusalem. So Streeter says the only way to really understand Christ's teaching and his beliefs is to grasp the nettle. It's difficult for us now because we know the world didn't end. So we're kind of saying the Son of God got it wrong as Christians, which is it's a bit awkward to put it mildly. But Streeter says it's there in the Gospels again and again. He says the end is coming, it's not going to be long. We have to face that. We have to get back to this first century Jew, clear all the myth away and see the real man. Okay, so Jesus got it wrong. So he thought he was going to die. And that when he died, the end of the world would come. And so therefore, when he let this happen to him, he did it under a false belief. This is what Streeter says. He offered himself up to die in the conviction that by his death he would end the world. And you have to say that from a modern perspective, this is a strange belief. Streeter says, yes, of course it's strange. He's a first century Jew. He's different from us. But if you want to understand him, you have to accept that's what he believed. We know he was wrong, unfortunately. And at a certain point, Jesus also realised he was wrong. When he'd been hanging on the cross for a few hours, this great cry of despair broke out from him, and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Streeter says, well, how are we to interpret that? Streeter makes a great play of this cry of despair in his book, and he says that 19 centuries afterwards, what he predicted has still not happened. And Streeter says that those words make you question not only whether Jesus was the Son of God, but whether God exists at all. Because if God exists, how could Jesus go through this despair? Okay, so from that you can imagine what Streeter has to say about this. Easter, the central mystery for Christians, the kind of belief they have that makes their guru different from every other, but proves he was a unicorn in a world of horses, so to speak, that he rose from the dead. Streeter says, no, come on, this is the modern world. We have to be scientific, we have to be a bit more rational about things. We all know that dead bodies don't just get up and start walking around. What actually happened was that his disciples, being mystics, being first century Jews, had visions. And again, one thinks of the visions people had of Bhagavan after he was dead. They had visions which convinced them that he was alive, but we now know that he wasn't. So that's it. The central mystery is gone, so to speak. I can't really, I don't think, overemphasise how important this was for Chadwick. Let's remember, or I'll tell you in case you don't already know, the last word to pass Chadwick's lips on his deathbed in India was Easter. That was the last word he spoke. Perhaps, I don't know what that means. Perhaps it means that in the end the leopard can't change its spots. You can't escape your roots, and that in extremis, when you're facing death and so on, what comes out of you automatically is what was put in during your childhood, so that the end of life sort of reflects the beginning. Maybe that's what it means, I don't know. But anyway, the last word he spoke was Easter. Even after all those years with Bhagavan and Hinduism and the Vedas and all that sort of stuff, it was Easter was the word. And so it must have been, to lose his faith in it as a teenager must have been absolutely awful. Another proof of how important it all was to him is this, also from the ashram archive. Chadwick has sat down in his room at the ashram and written out by hand all the words that Jesus was supposed to have said on the cross. Not many Christians would do this. Mr. Ramamani, I'm sorry, was that right? The editor of the Mountain Path.
Anand Rajan's son.
Anand Rajan's son.
The railway station mason. Yeah.
No, Mr. Ramamani, the editor of the Mountain Path.
Yeah, but he was Anand Rajan's son.
What was the name?
Ramamani, he's saying.
Yeah, Ramamani.
No.
Anyway,
Anand Rajan was a station mason.
he was a friend of Chadwick,
Yeah,
exactly.
he's station master's son.
He told me Chadwick was, that's right, a station master's son. I remember him now. I've got it. Chadwick was more Hindu than most Hindus. Which is very interesting. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in a way it's true. I wouldn't argue with him anyway. He wasn't a person, it seemed to me in our short conversation, that used words lightly. And I think it was true. I think Chadwick was more Hindu than most Hindus. But I think this proves that in some strange paradoxical way, he was also more Christian than most Christians. Who else but a very devout Christian would sit down in his room and write out these words from the Gospels? I've never done anything like that. My Catholic relatives, I don't think, have. It says something about Chadwick. So we're going to move on now to the next little bit, but I just leave you with that thought. At the age of 19, Chadwick, or maybe 20, 21 I should say, Chadwick lost his faith in Easter. Disaster. Okay, we were saying, what went wrong? This is, I think, where it went wrong. Certainly, we do know for a fact that he dropped out of Oxford, and we also know what he did next. What he did next is symbolically very eloquent. This is a person who communicates with his biographer in sort of hints and symbols. And here's one of them that he gives us. He never wrote about what happened to him at this period, but in his private notes, he says, this is after dropping out of university, much unhappiness and change. Well, you would expect that, wouldn't you? For about, just judging from the records that I've looked up, for about 18 months after this great crisis of faith, he seems to have gone into limbo and just done nothing. Years later, in India, he was to tell his friends, I've done every job under the sun. And I think this is where it started. He just moved from job to job. He never really had a career after this. He was never really part of English society again. After he dropped out of university, he never dropped back in. He was always an outsider, he was always an exile. He spent his whole life wandering. He never settled down until he arrived at the feet of the Maharshi, and then he knew that he'd found his home, as it were. But until that point, until 1935, he was just wandering. And this is where it started. March 1913, went to Canada, where things started to improve. Travel lifted his spirits. This is again and again in his biography. You see, this is Chadwick's response. When there's a problem, run away. He moved on and he started to cheer up. The great thing about the internet is that you can now look at these records, and this is just for a bit of sort of atmosphere about the research and so on. Here we see Chadwick going out to India, calling himself a tourist in 1914. This is where he went. Dennis, can you pronounce that?
Saskatchewan?
Yeah, Saskatchewan. Brilliant. Saskatchewan. It's big, it's empty, and it's in the middle of nowhere.
Still is.
And it's called Saskatchewan. As I say, a beautiful symbol. He's gone into the wilderness. He's lost his faith. He's let down his father, his church, his family, his country, and all that sort of stuff. What does he do? He it's symbolic. He tries to kill himself. That's what I feel. What could be closer to death than this? I'm sorry for the Canadians. It's a vast wilderness in the middle of nowhere. Chadwick cast himself into it. He said he went out there as a tourist. This is look at the map. There's only 3 places that Google think worth mentioning, and one of them is called Medicine Hat. I just find that hilarious. Medicine Hat. Anyway, Chadwick went to a place called Prince Albert, which is not actually on Google, but that's where it is. He went to Prince Albert. And once he'd arrived there, he started to cheer up. So rather than being a tourist, he decided to be a surveyor. He took a job surveying the wilderness in Canada. Again, look at the symbolism, the poets among you. It's beautiful. He was tracking the wilderness. He was dividing up into squares. And it's a spiritual activity as well. You can imagine that you feel God here in a way that you didn't feel him in Oxford, possibly, in this freezing cold, empty place. This is just showing... Oh yes, okay, there we are. 18 months of surveying in Canada brought Chadwick up to August 1914. Sorry, the map's a bit of a mess. That's Google. April 1914. August 1914, sorry. We all know what happened then. If he wanted to die, this was his big opportunity. To get back to England, to join the army. I think when war broke out in August, Chadwick was sort of up here somewhere. And he had to get back to Prince Albert. From there, he had to get all the way across to Quebec. From Quebec, he got aboard this very ship, the HMS Calgarian, just for a bit of fun. You can imagine it steaming back to England. I don't know how long it took, but a long time. And here's the record of his arrival back in Liverpool. I've highlighted the date, 20th of August, because it's only 10 days after the outbreak of the First World War. The key notes of Chadwick's character were loyalty, duty, honesty and integrity. That's what he was. He was what you call a kind of straight-up guy. And the moment war was declared, he got straight on his horse and came back to England. He was the first officer. He joined up 2 days after this. And remember, there was no obligation to join the army at this time. You just turned up if you wanted to. 2 days after his arrival, he was in uniform. He joined up. He was the first officer ever gazetted into his regiment, and at the end of the war, he was to be the last officer ever gazetted out of it. So it's an enormously proud war record, and it's a tribute to his great loyalty to his country. And I kind of feel, amateur psychology, he'd let down God, he'd let down the family and all that sort of stuff. But he damn well wasn't going to let down the King of England. The King of Heaven he might have let down. The King of England, this he could still do. He could still sort of die for his country, and he rushed back to do it. And the interesting thing is that he says in his notes that these first months in the army, which I must be honest would be hell to me, I can't imagine anything worse, he said that it was a very happy time. I think for the first time since dropping out of university, he felt he was back. His life had a meaning, there was a framework, he was back in English society, he was doing his duty, and all those things. This is very Chadwickian. Those were the things that made him happy, and I think that's why when he arrived in India, he was so happy there, because he knew what his duty was, so to speak. Okay, Chadwick became what's called a pioneer. I don't know how clearly you can see that. This is the pioneer badge. As you can see, it has a rifle and also a shovel and a pickaxe. The idea being that the pioneers were the ones who would keep the trenches going. The trenches were a vast industrial enterprise. They needed a lot of work doing. They needed things to be dug and railways to be laid and buildings to be built and wells to be bored, trees to be cut down. Someone had to do that, and it was the pioneers. Chadwick didn't ask to be a pioneer. I don't think any of them did. He just wanted to be an ordinary soldier. But that's the work he was put onto. Just a couple of pictures to show you the sort of thing he would have been doing. Here are some pioneers laying railways, and here's some more of them. Well, that's someone climbing over some barbed wire. But this sort of barbed wire horror would have been the sort of thing that Chadwick was responsible for producing. He would have had to climb up into the dreaded no man's land where the Germans could almost hear you cough and lay out this barbed wire in the dark. It was a very, very dangerous job. These are the officers of Chadwick's regiment. This photograph was taken just a couple of days before they went out to France. I don't know if you can spot Chadwick from where you're sitting. He's right at the back in the middle.
Tallest.
He's the tallest. If they thought that being pioneers and laying railways and all that sort of thing was going to keep them out of danger, these guys were very wrong. 1 in 3 of them was dead by the end of the war, which is about a sort of normal attrition rate for a normal casualty regiment. So it was not a soft option, is what I'm saying. It was incredibly tough. And now I'm going to focus on. So this is the first adult photograph we have of Chadwick, as far as I know. It's a bit blurry, but this is Chadwick on the eve of going out to war.
Sadhu Arunachala.
You must have Sadhu Arunachala, yeah.
No, Sadhu Arunachala.
You must have realised at this point that he might be dead, within a few days, and that he'd be lucky, certainly, to survive the whole conflict. By the time they went out, they knew what they were in store for. Chadwick's people. They knew it was not going to be Waterloo. It was going to be something much more modern and much nastier, and generally horrific. I found out some very interesting things about Chadwick's war record. I think I'm probably over time already, so I'm going to rush slightly. Yes, I am. God. I found some very interesting things. I'm just going to focus on 2 of them. And the first is this. This is a picture of the Maudsley Hospital in Denmark Hill, as it was during the war. Today the Maudsley's a big hospital. It's one of the biggest neurological hospitals in England. It was set up during the First World War to cope with the epidemic of shell shock cases coming back from the front. And unfortunately, Chadwick was one of them. Chadwick, in 1916, went to pieces. And he was diagnosed with shell shock. I don't know the exact details of it, but months after he was admitted here, they were saying his shell shock was severe, not permanent. Severe. That's months afterwards. So I imagine that day in 1916, when he turned up here, he may have been a gibbering wreck. There were different forms of shell shock. Some people completely froze. Others would scream and rave and all that sort of thing. Others would have nightmares, flashbacks, and all that ghastly, ghastly stuff. It was little understood at the time, what we would now call post-traumatic stress. It was badly understood. They believed that shell shock was caused by a physical concussion to the membranes of the skull. It was a physical problem, and they believed that all those explosions going on literally shook you up, and eventually your mind stopped functioning normally. And we know that in 1916, just before this happened, Chadwick had the bad luck to be wounded in the head by a rifle grenade. It was a serious wound. It kept him behind the lines for a whole month with a physical problem just getting better. And if you'd been told that shell shock was caused by an impact to the skull, you would naturally go back to the front, perhaps fearing, this is it, how can I hold myself together after that? And he couldn't. He lasted back at the front for about 8 days before he ended up here. That's ghastly. And then Chadwick, after a short spell in hospital, was sent back home. Imagine his emotions on arriving. Imagine the emotions of his parents, who'd sent him away as a sort of 6'2", healthy, brave young man, and saw him return to them. War was not what you thought it was going to be in those days. It was very nasty. And it's impossible not to feel huge sympathy with Chadwick, but it's impossible also not to feel huge admiration for him, because after he stared into the abyss of mental illness and the abyss of himself, possibly, he pulled himself back together, he returned to the front, he served till the end of the war very honourably. He was mentioned in dispatches, he got an OBE, he rose, as we know, to the rank of major, and generally gave a very, very good account of himself. During that second period of service, he was again wounded in the head, but this time he just carried on. So he'd found some kind of reserve of toughness in himself that allowed him to see the thing through to the end. Then at the end of the war, he went to pieces again. So he sort of held himself together right to the end, did everything he had to do, and then hit the bottle once more when he was back in England, probably celebrating, and again admitted himself to a shell shock clinic. But that was only for a short period. And I think after that he completely recovered and continued with his life. But no doubt that the war and this is a sort of dark episode in Chadwick's past. As I found a lot of interesting things about the various battles he was involved in, and I did originally want to show you all sorts of maps, sort of military maps, showing what he'd done and so on. This is no time. I'm just going to show you one map, because this is the key engagement of the war. This is a map that shows the German spring offensive of 1918. It was the most dramatic action of the whole war. In 1918, the Germans punched through the Allied lines. Here's the line before the offensive, there's the line after it. They swept over our territory, so to speak, in a vast tidal wave that just swamped 50 miles. When they punched through, Chadwick was here. This red dot represents Chadwick, so he was right up against it. So far from what I told you, you could have thought he spent his whole time sort of digging and that sort of thing. This is where he had to put down his shovel and pick up his gun. Many of you must know Sri Ganeshan in the ashram. He was a good friend of Chadwick's in later years. And when I interviewed Ganeshan about Chadwick, Ganeshan said, "Oh, Chadwick once said to me, 'Oh, Ganeshan, I've killed 1,000 men.'" If he did, and probably a sort of figure of speech, but it gives you an idea of what he went through as a Christian, mark you. If he did, it was during this engagement. After the Germans had broken through, Chadwick's pioneer unit was sent to the front to try and hold them back, whilst everyone else escaped. The rest of the division escaped over the Somme River. So Chadwick's job was to hold back this vast German advance. At one point, he and his little unit retook a village from the Germans, which implies not only heroism, but hand-to-hand fighting and killing. At another point, they were on a high ridge of trenches with the Germans advancing below them. Chadwick had learnt to shoot at school, and so he just lay there, as far as I can gather, killing German after German after German. Whether he killed 1,000 men, I don't know, but it must have felt like it. So this was all pretty ghastly. So that's it, we're going to have to leave Chadwick's war record now. A couple of things to show. This is, from the point of view of Chadwick's biography, he says here, inherited a competency. A competency at the end of the war. He got his hands on a small private income that meant he didn't have to work for a living anymore. And this explains a lot. He was not from a rich background, but he always seemed able to support himself in India. And this is where it happened. I haven't been able to track where it came from. He inherited a little bit of money that enabled him to live modestly for the rest of his life. And by the time he was, I think, about 1930, so when he was 40 years old, he was already calling himself retired at about the age of 40. That's what I'm not going to bother with that anymore, and I don't blame him. This is the post-war period. OBE, left army, period not bad, much drinking. You can imagine he had a lot to celebrate. Okay, this is a picture. We're back on to spiritual questions now. We've got to go. Okay, I just two more minutes. Chadwick said at the end of the war, a friend had given him the Bhagavad Gita. I've chosen this picture because it kind of illustrates why someone who's just been through what Chadwick had just been through might love the Bhagavad Gita. He said he clung to it, it became his constant companion. I don't know, but I think maybe it provided a sort of framework for understanding these ghastly things that he'd seen and done, which was not available in Christianity. So we're asking what went wrong. The first thing was that at university, he lost his faith in Christianity, and then after the trauma of the war, he found this. So you can see, it's almost as if God didn't want him to become a priest at all. It's almost as if God is steering him in a different direction, first away from Christianity, then towards Hinduism, and we'll see tomorrow how he was eventually steered towards Arunachala. I'll talk tomorrow, if I've got some time, a bit about his life in the ashram and his relationship with Bhagwan. Okay, thank you.
Wow, wonderful.
Thank you.